J.B. Beasley and Tracy Hallett. On the evening of July 31st, 1999, two best friends left Dothan, Alabama. Around 10 that night in a black 1993 Mazda to attend a birthday celebration. It was J.B. Beasley's 17th birthday. They got lost and ended up in Ozark, more than 20 miles off course. Security camera footage captured them at the Big Little Store, a gas station on East Broad Street, around 11:20 that night. Tracy called her mother from a payphone. "Mom, I love you. Be home soon." A grainy surveillance image also showed an unidentified small white pickup truck at the gas pumps at the same time. Neither girl made it home. J.B. Hilton Green Beasley was a rising senior at Northview High School, a member of the Junior Honor Society and cheer squad, described by family as full of energy with a passion for dance. Tracy Jean Hallett was also a rising senior at Northview. Her father had passed away when she was 4. She dreamed of becoming a doctor. The two were inseparable. The next morning, the Mazda was found on Herring Avenue in Ozark, muddy and nearly out of gas. Around 2 that afternoon, police opened the trunk and found both girls, each from a single gunshot wound to the head. Their purses, jewelry, and money were untouched. Nothing was taken. 2 months later, the state crime lab reported traces of biological evidence on J.B.'s clothing and skin. Police conducted over 500 interviews and tested more than 70 potential suspects. Every single one was eliminated. None matched the DNA recovered from the scene. The profile was entered into CODIS, the National Law Enforcement DNA Database, but returned nothing because the person responsible had no criminal record of any kind. He had never been arrested. He had never been convicted. He had never been swabbed. His genetic information existed nowhere in the system. The case was featured on America's Most Wanted in 2000 and on the A&E. Series Haunting Evidence in 2007, generating tips that led nowhere. In 2015, a former auxiliary police volunteer named Rena Crum publicly alleged a police cover-up, claiming officers in Ozark had been involved. Her allegations drew national attention and complicated the investigation for years. But in August of 2022, Crum appeared in court and recanted under oath, stating one word: "I lied." Years of misdirection undone in a single sentence. How do you find someone who left biological evidence at a crime scene but has no record, no prior arrests, and no presence in any law enforcement database? Inspired by the Golden State Killer arrest in April of 2018, Ozark Police Chief Marlos Walker contacted Parabon Nanolabs. Parabon's genetic genealogy team uploaded the evidence DNA to GED match. A relative's voluntary submission led genealogists down a family tree to one man, Coley Lewis McCraney of Dothan. On January 24, 2019, McCraney voluntarily provided a DNA sample at the urging of his wife. The Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences confirmed the match. Coley Lewis McCraney was approximately 25 at the time. He was a Carroll High School graduate, Navy veteran, and long-haul truck driver who had lived in the Dothan area his entire life. In 2013, he founded a nonprofit ministry called Spirit and Truth Lifeline Ministries and served as a bishop at a local church. He preached, he counseled. He presented himself as a man of faith. He had no prior criminal record of any kind, no arrests, no convictions, nothing that would have placed his DNA in any database anywhere. He lived approximately 1 mile from where the car was found with the 2 girls inside. He was arrested on March 15, 2019, without incident during a routine traffic stop, 20 years after the night at the gas station. At trial in April of 2023, McCraney took the stand and claimed he had met Beasley weeks earlier and that their encounter that night was consensual, a story he had never told anyone in 20 years. On April 26th, the jury found him guilty on all counts and sentenced him to life without parole. The Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals upheld the conviction in September of 2024. The Alabama Supreme Court refused to hear his appeal in December of 2024. McCraney is currently incarcerated at Donaldson Correctional Facility near Birmingham. That case took 20 years and a genealogy database to crack. But the next one would take even longer, and the evidence that solved it came from the victim herself, who fought back hard enough to make her attacker bleed. Michelle Martinko. On the evening of December 19, 1979, an 18-year-old senior at Cedar Rapids Kennedy High School in Iowa attended a concert choir banquet at the Sheraton Inn, then drove alone to Westdale Mall in her family's 1972 Buick Electra. She was carrying about $180 to buy a winter coat. She was last seen around 9 that evening near a jewelry store inside the mall. When she had not returned by 2 in the morning, her father reported her missing. Around 4 that morning, police found the Buick in the mall's northeast parking lot. Michelle was inside, collapsed over the passenger seat. Michelle Marie Martinko was a talented performer, a baton twirler, choir member, and theater participant who styled her blonde hair like Farrah Fawcett. She planned to attend Iowa State University to study interior design. Her mother, Janet, had reportedly suffered 5 miscarriages before Michelle's birth, making her especially cherished by the family. She was 18 years old and weeks away from the holidays when she walked through the mall doors for the last time. She had been stabbed 29 times in the face, neck, and chest. One wound penetrated her aorta, but her hands bore defensive wounds, showing she fought fiercely, and in doing so, caused her attacker to cut himself, leaving his blood on the gear shift lever and on her dress. That blood would sit in evidence for nearly 4 decades before science caught up. A full male DNA profile was eventually developed from the blood on the gear shift lever and on Michelle's dress, with a match probability of less than 1 in 100 billion. That blood had been sitting in evidence since 1979, waiting for science to evolve. Over the decades, more than 125 people were swabbed and tested. 80 suspects were formally eliminated, all cleared. The person responsible was not among them. He had no connection to Michelle that anyone could find. He was not a classmate, not a co-worker, not a neighbor. He appeared to have been a complete stranger who crossed her path on one evening and was never seen again. In September of 2016, Parabon Nano Labs produced a DNA phenotype composite, a computer-generated image based on the genetic markers in the evidence, showing a light-skinned man with blonde hair. This contradicted the original 1980 witness sketch entirely, which had depicted a brown-eyed, curly-haired man. The sketch investigators had been working from for nearly 4 decades. The face they had circulated to the public, shown to witnesses, and used to evaluate suspects, had been wrong the entire time. Every person eliminated because they did not resemble the sketch may have been dismissed based on a false premise. What happens when the sketch investigators rely on for decades turns out to be a portrait of the wrong person entirely? In May of 2018, inspired by the Golden State Killer case, Detective Matt Denlinger worked with Parabon's genetic genealogy unit to upload the DNA to GED match. The database returned a match to a woman determined to be the suspect's second cousin once removed. Genealogists built family trees and narrowed the field to 3 brothers from Manchester, Iowa. Police covertly collected DNA from all 3. On October 29, 2018, investigators followed Jerry Lynn Burns to a Pizza Ranch restaurant and collected his discarded soda straw. The lab confirmed a match. Jerry Lynn Burns was 25 at the time. He was a lifelong Manchester resident who owned a powder coating business. He had no prior criminal record and no known connection to Michelle Martinko. On December 19, 2018, exactly 39 years after the incident, Burns was arrested at his business. A jailhouse informant later testified Burns told him he wished he had listened to his dad and cleaned up after Bart himself, and that nobody was thinking about DNA in 1979. On February 24, 2020, after 3 hours of deliberation, the jury found Burns guilty. He was sentenced to life without parole plus $150,000 in restitution. The Iowa Supreme Court affirmed the conviction in March of 2023. Burns, now 72, maintains someone else was responsible. He is serving life at Anamosa State Penitentiary. That case was solved by a discarded straw at a pizza restaurant. But the next one would be solved by a card prepared during the suspect's own autopsy, because he had already been gone for 7 years. Tracy Hammerberg. On the evening of December 14, 1984, an 18-year-old from Saukville, Wisconsin, babysat for a family, then met friends. The group bought drinks at a local tavern and attended a party on South Garfield Street in Port Washington. Around 12:30 in the morning, friends offered Tracy a ride home. She declined, choosing to walk the 3.7 miles home along Highway 33. It was not unusual behavior for her. She had done it before. She never made it. Tracy Lynn Hammerberg attended Port Washington High School and worked as a babysitter to earn spending money. She had a boyfriend who had recently moved to North Dakota, and she planned to join him there as soon as she could. She always wore his class ring on her finger. She was 18 years old, mapping out the beginning of an adult life that was supposed to take her somewhere new. She chose to walk home that night because she had done it before, because the distance did not scare her, and because she did not want to inconvenience anyone for a ride. It was a decision made out of independence. It should not have been the last one she ever made. At 5:45 the next morning, a man named Dan Sieracki found her partially clothed body on a snowy driveway on Maple Road in the town of Grafton. She had been harmed, strangled, and struck with a metallic object. Biological evidence and material from under her fingernails were recovered, indicating she had fought back. A pack of Marlboro cigarettes, not her brand, was found near the body. Someone else had been on that road that night. Someone who smoked a brand, Tracy did not. The Ozaukee County Sheriff's Office conducted the largest DNA collection effort in Wisconsin history at that time, eliminating over 400 men. The person responsible was never among them. His name never surfaced during the investigation. He was never a suspect. How do you identify someone who was never tested, never questioned, and never once appeared in the investigation? In March of 2019, investigators contacted the Los Angeles FBI Forensic Genetic Genealogy Team. Evidence DNA was uploaded to GED Match and MyHeritage, identifying 2 second cousins. Genealogists traced the family tree back 4 generations and forward again, landing on a family in Port Washington and specifically on Philip J. Cross. But Cross had passed away from a drug overdose in 2012 at age 48. His DNA was obtained from a card prepared during his 2012 autopsy. On September 3, 2019, the Wisconsin State Crime Lab confirmed the match, with odds of 1 in 7 trillion. The case was announced as solved on October 22, 2019. Philip J. Cross was 21 at the time. He lived with his parents on Green Bay Road in Port Washington and worked the overnight shift at a plastics company in Grafton. Highway 33, where Tracy was walking, was the same road Cross drove home on after his shift. Their paths would have crossed at exactly the time she was on that road. He had a history of escalating behavior, expelled from high school for a bomb threat, sent to a reform facility, convicted of forgery, and in 1991, he attempted to strangle a woman with his belt. The pattern was documented, but nobody connected him to Tracy's case because his DNA was never collected during his lifetime. The sheriff called him an obvious sociopath. Cross passed away in a Milwaukee motel in 2012 at age 48. He lived another 28 years after what he did to Tracy without ever being questioned or suspected. No trial was possible. Tracy's sister Lori said, "I am mad because he passed before I could yell at him." She had waited 35 years for a name. She got one, but she never got to face the person attached to it. The Marlboro cigarettes found near the body were never conclusively linked to Cross, but investigators noted he was a smoker. The brand was not Tracy's. It belonged to whoever else was on that road that night. That case was closed by an autopsy card from a man who had been gone for 7 years. But the next one would require tracing a DNA trail all the way back to a small Italian village in the 1600s. Lindy Sue Beekler. On December 5, 1975, a 19-year-old newlywed returned to her first-floor apartment at the Spring Manor complex in Manor Township, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, carrying 4 bags of groceries. She had spent the day at work tying ribbons on poinsettias at Landis Flowers and Gifts, then picked up her husband's paycheck, cashed it, and went shopping. She arrived home between 6:45 and 7:15 that evening. Shortly after, an intruder entered the apartment. There were no signs of forced entry. At 8:42 that night, Lindy's aunt stopped by and found her on the living room floor. She had been stabbed 19 times and harmed. A butcher knife was embedded in her neck with a tea towel wrapped around the handle. In the weeks before, Lindy had told family she felt she was being watched. Lindy Sue Little Beekler had graduated from Conestoga Valley High School in 1973 and dreamed of opening her own flower shop. She loved working with plants and arrangements and had found a job that let her do exactly that. She and her husband Philip had just started building a life together. They had moved into the Spring Manor apartment as their first home. She was 19 years old, newly married, and working towards something she cared about. The apartment was supposed to be a starting point, not an ending. A male DNA profile was developed from evidence in 1997, more than 2 decades after the incident, and entered into CODIS in 2000. No match. The profile sat in the database for 19 years without generating a single lead. In 2019, Lancaster County's Cold Case Unit enlisted Parabon Nano Labs. When genealogist C.C. Moore uploaded the DNA to GenMatch, only extremely distant relatives appeared, with common ancestors from the 1600s and 1700s. The connections were so remote that standard genealogical methods could not build a marked, usable family tree. Moore had hit a wall that would have stopped most investigators. So she developed a new approach entirely. She analyzed the DNA's ethnic markers and determined the suspect's ancestors came from Gasparina, a small village in Calabria, southern Italy. It was an extraordinarily specific finding. Moore then cross-referenced Lancaster County immigration records from the late 1800s and early 1900s, identifying families who had emigrated from that region. She narrowed the pool to about 2,300 people with Italian genetic ties to the Gasparina area, then filtered by age, gender, and geographic proximity. An old newspaper clipping revealed a name at a familiar address, a resident of the Spring Manor apartment complex. David Vincent Sinopoli had lived in the same 4-unit building, on the second floor directly above Lindy. He had been living above her the entire time. The man who entered her apartment with no signs of forced entry had a key, or he had access, or he simply knew when the door would be open, because he lived directly upstairs and could hear everything. Who traces a DNA profile back 400 years to a village in southern Italy, cross-references immigration records from a century ago, and then discovers the suspect lived directly above the victim in the same 4-unit building? On February 11, 2022, detectives at Philadelphia International Airport followed Sinopoli as he prepared to board a flight to Aruba. They waited until he purchased a coffee, drank from it, and discarded the cup. They retrieved the coffee cup from a trash receptacle and sent it to Pittsburgh-based Cybergenetics for comparison. The lab confirmed the match at approximately 1 in 10 trillion. A single coffee cup at an airport gate, discarded without a second thought, connected a 68-year-old man to a crime committed 47 years earlier in an apartment 1 floor below his own. David Vincent Sinopoli was 68 at the time of his arrest. He had lived his entire life in Lancaster County. He attended McCaskey High School, overlapping 1 year with Lindy. In 2004, he pleaded guilty to invasion of privacy for spying on a woman at his wife's business. He was arrested July 17, 2022. On October 19, 2023, Sinopoli pleaded guilty to third-degree charges, aggravated assault, and burglary. He was sentenced to 25 to 50 years, effectively a life sentence at age 69. C.C. Moore described Sinopoli as part of a new class of criminals uncovered by genetic genealogy. Once-and-done offenders who commit one horrific act and fade back into ordinary life for decades. That case required tracing ancestry back to the 1600s. But the next one would be announced as solved on the exact 40th anniversary of the victim's passing. And the suspect had already been gone for 2 years before anyone learned his name. Christine Gallegos. On the night of May 15, 1985, an 18-year-old from Kearns, Utah, told her fiancé she was going to hitchhike to work at a bar in downtown Salt Lake City. She was last seen on 4000 West in Kearns, walking toward the freeway. About an hour later, residents near South Jefferson Street reported hearing 2 gunshots. At approximately 3:50 the next morning, a passerby found Christine's body in the roadway. She had been severely beaten, harmed, stabbed, and shot twice in the head. Christine Gallegos was engaged to her fiancé, Troy, and they had plans to start a family together. Her mother, Leah, described her as outgoing, sweet, and just special. She was 18 years old and looking ahead to everything that was supposed to come next. She had a job, a partner, and a direction. She chose to hitchhike that night because it was how she got around. It was normal for her. It should not have been the last decision she ever made. Detective Cordon Parks later reconstructed the sequence of events. The person responsible picked Christine up while she hitchhiked along the road, drove her to a secluded area near Old Dirks Field, on the outskirts of the city, and harmed her. When she fought free and tried to escape on foot, he stabbed and shot her as she fled, leaving a blood trail from where she fell to the gutter where her body was found. She tried to run. She nearly got away. The blood trail showed the distance she covered before she went down. She was fighting to the very end. The case sat dormant for decades, with no actionable leads. In 2010, the unknown male DNA was entered into CODIS. No match. The person responsible had no criminal record that would have placed his profile in any database. In 2020, private investigator Jason Jensen, working independently, had Christine's preserved boots tested at a private lab and succeeded in revealing usable male DNA that had survived on the leather for 35 years. The boots had been sitting in evidence storage since 1985. Nobody had thought to test them until Jensen pushed for it. In September of 2023, evidence was sent to Othram Labs in Texas, funded by a federal sexual assault kit initiative grant. Othram's forensic-grade genome sequencing and genetic genealogy identified Ricky Lee Stallworth Sr. But Stallworth had passed away of natural causes on July 1, 2023, just 2 months before his name surfaced. He missed being identified by weeks. A voluntary DNA swab from Stallworth's son, tested through Othram's comparison platform, confirmed the match beyond any doubt. How close did investigators come to identifying this man while he was still alive? And what would have happened if the evidence had been sent to Othram just 1 year earlier? The case was announced as closed on May 15, 2025, exactly 40 years to the day. Ricky Lee Stallworth Sr., born November 2, 1957, in Chicago, was a U.S. Air Force airman stationed at Hill Air Force Base in Layton, Utah, at the time of Christine's passing. He was serving his country while carrying out acts that would not be discovered for 4 decades. Married 4 times over the course of his life. Described in his obituary as a loving family man. But Detective Parks learned through interviews with former partners and associates that Stallworth was a nocturnal prowler. A person who regularly left home late at night and returned around 5 in the morning, spending the early hours driving the streets alone. In the last 2 years of his life, he had police contact related to interactions with women working on the streets at night. One former wife told detectives she was not surprised at all to learn he was a suspect in a case like this. She had seen the signs. She had lived with them. He had no known connection to Christine Gallegos. They had never met before the night he picked her up on the road. No trial was possible. He passed away 2 months before Othram would have named him. 40 years of silence ended on the anniversary of the night it began. That case was closed on the exact anniversary of the crime. But the next one would involve a young babysitter, a suspect whose name appeared in the original investigation, and a cremation that made direct DNA confirmation impossible. Maria Lorraine Hansel. On the evening of February 7, 1977, a young girl went to babysit for her neighbor's 2 boys at the Suncrest Apartments on the 5400 block of North Nevada Avenue in Colorado Springs, Colorado. She called her best friend during the evening. "I love these kids, and I am babysitting. I better get going. I love you." Those were their last words to each other. After one of the boys went to bed around 8 that evening, a man entered the apartment. There were no signs of forced entry. One of the boys woke up and saw a male holding the babysitter's mouth shut. He heard screaming and the words, "Stop it." The man took her into the master bedroom. When the boy's mother returned at 11:20 that night, she found the babysitter stabbed to death with multiple wounds to the chest and a prominent wound to the neck. The boys were asleep and unharmed. Maria Lorraine Honzel was the middle child of 8 siblings. She had recently lost her mother to heart complications on December 26, 1976, just 6 weeks earlier. The loss had reshaped the entire family overnight. Maria, who was the most nurturing of the siblings, had stepped into a mother figure role for her younger brothers and sisters, particularly her 6-year-old sister Erica, who needed her most. Her best friend Kathy Moberly described her as full of love and light, always skipping instead of walking, the kind of person who radiated warmth without trying. Maria dreamed of becoming a social worker and having a dozen kids of her own. She was still grieving her mother when she walked into that apartment to take care of 2 boys she adored. She went there because she loved children and because she needed the money, and because it was the kind of thing she always did for the people around her. If you have made it this far and enjoy content like this, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps more than you think and keeps us bringing you stories like these. A bloodstain on Maria's clothing that did not belong to her yielded a male DNA profile when it was finally tested years later. It was entered into CODIS, no match. In 2019, Colorado Springs police engaged Parabon Nanolabs for genetic genealogy. The genealogical research proved exceptionally difficult. It took approximately 5 years, stretching from 2019 to 2024. Working through distant family connections and partial matches before investigators identified William Charles Kernan Jr., a college student in Colorado Springs at the time, who had been an acquaintance of the boy's mother, Jani Kuslika, and had visited the apartment complex before the night in question. He knew the layout. He knew who lived there. He may have known when the babysitter would be alone with the children. But Kernan had passed away in 2010 in Cheyenne Wells, Colorado, and was cremated, making direct DNA confirmation impossible. There was no body to exhume. There was no biological sample preserved anywhere. Investigators had to build their case entirely on the strength of the genealogical evidence, the circumstantial connections between Kernan and the apartment complex, and the fact that no other candidate in the family tree fit the profile. How do you confirm a suspect's identity when they have been cremated and no direct DNA comparison will ever be possible? CSPD confirmed Kernan's name had appeared in initial 1977 investigation efforts, but he was not considered a suspect at the time. His name was in the file 47 years ago. It had been sitting in the original case documents, written down by an investigator who spoke to him and moved on. Nobody went back. Nobody connected him to the evidence. On May 8th, 2024, the District Attorney's Office declared confidence in the identification based on the totality of the genealogical evidence, the familial DNA connections, and Kernan's documented access to the apartment, and the case was closed as exceptionally cleared, death of offender. Maria's sister Erica, who was 6 years old when she lost both her mother and her surrogate mother within 6 weeks of each other, was now in her 50s when she finally learned a name. She had carried the weight of not knowing for 47 years. She lost 2 mothers before she turned 7, and it took nearly half a century for anyone to explain the second loss. That case was closed without a direct DNA match because the suspect had been cremated. But the next one would clear an innocent sister who spent 35 years under a cloud of suspicion she did nothing to deserve. Risa Trexler. On June 15, 1984, just days after the last day of school, a 15-year-old from Salisbury, North Carolina, went to her grandparents' house at 714 North Shaver Street, while her grandfather went to the grocery store and her grandmother went to the hairdresser. She was alone for approximately 4 hours. Around 5:15 that afternoon, her grandfather Walt Monroe returned and screamed. Her 13-year-old sister Jody ran over and found Risa in a spare bedroom. She had suffered approximately 18 stab wounds to the neck and chest. The most severe severed her spinal cord. A knife blade was embedded in her right shoulder. Evidence of an encounter was found. A hair from an individual of a different background than Risa was discovered on her body. There was no forced entry and nothing was taken. Risa Dawn Trexler loved swimming, children, and psychology, and planned to attend college to study how people think and why they behave the way they do. She attended Salisbury High School as a rising junior and was described as very well liked by classmates and teachers alike. She was the kind of student who showed up, participated, and made the people around her feel comfortable. She lived with her mother Vicky, father Gary, and younger sister Jody at a house on the corner of Bringle Ferry Road and Shaver Street, right next door to their maternal grandparents, Walter and Mrs. Monroe. The two houses were close enough that the children moved freely between them. It was a safe arrangement. The grandparents' house was supposed to be an extension of home, not the place where everything would go wrong. The FBI profiled the person responsible as a white male between 18 and 24. That profile turned out to be entirely wrong. It pointed investigators in the wrong direction for decades. Suspicion fell heavily on 13-year-old Jody, Risa's own sister, who endured decades of community gossip and accusation. People in Salisbury whispered behind her back. They pointed at her in public. They made assumptions about a child who had just lost her sister in the most horrific way imaginable. And those assumptions followed Jody Trexler for 35 years. She grew up under a shadow that she did nothing to create and could do nothing to escape. The suspicion shaped her entire adult life, her relationships, her reputation, and her ability to grieve. She was never charged, never arrested, never formally accused. But the whispers were enough to destroy a life all on their own. In April of 2018, Jody appeared on the Dr. Phil show, passed a polygraph, and spoke publicly for the first time about what the suspicion had cost her. The appearance sparked renewed interest in the case. Detective Sergeant Travis Schulenberger took the evidence kit out of storage and sent it to the North Carolina State Crime Lab, which developed a male DNA profile from preserved biological evidence. The profile existed. It had been sitting in a storage facility for 34 years, waiting for someone to test it. What does it feel like to spend 35 years under suspicion for the loss of your own sister? And then watch the same science that clears your name also reveal who was actually responsible. In March of 2019, the extract was sent to Parabon Nano Labs. By April, C.C. Moore's team used GED match to identify a suspect. Curtis Edward Blair Sr., a 40-year-old man who had worked at the Frito-Lay plant approximately 2 blocks from the grandparents' home. Blair had passed away in San Diego in 2004. His body was exhumed from Memorial Park Cemetery in Salisbury in June of 2019, and the State Crime Lab confirmed the match on August 6th. The exhumation took place in the same town where Jody had been whispered about for over 3 decades. The answer had been buried there the entire time. On December 3rd, 2019, the case was announced as solved. Jody Trexler Laird was completely exonerated. Blair had no connection to the family whatsoever. He simply worked 2 blocks away. No trial was possible. Risa's mother, Vicky, said, "So many nights wondering and wondering, and maybe now I can sleep." That case cleared an innocent sister after 35 years. But the next one holds a unique distinction as the first criminal case in history to use genetic genealogy for investigative leads, and it traced the suspect's ancestry all the way back to a passenger on the Mayflower. Sarah Yarborough. On the morning of Saturday, December 14th, 1991, a 16-year-old junior at Federal Way High School in Washington State raced to campus in her drill team uniform for a competition, arriving about 45 minutes early. She parked in the back lot. Sometime between 8 and 9:15 that morning, she was attacked and dragged approximately 300 feet to a brushy embankment near the tennis courts. A jogger noticed a girl on the ground, with a man kneeling over her, but assumed they were a couple. At about 9:20, two 13-year-old boys saw a man in a long, dark trench coat emerge from the bushes. They found Sarah moments later. She had been strangled with her own nylon stockings, beaten and harmed. Male DNA was found under her fingernails, proof that she fought for her life. Sarah Yarborough was an honor student, ballet dancer, and avid reader, the oldest of 3 children. She was described as artistic, imaginative, and kind. She could not decide between becoming a museum curator or an engineer like her father. A memorial plaque at her school reads, "Seeker of knowledge, wholeness, and holiness." Over 4,000 tips were submitted and 200 to 300 DNA swabs were collected and tested over the years. Every single one was eliminated. The case consumed enormous resources and produced no suspect. In 2011, King County investigators took an unprecedented step by contacting Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick of Identifinders International, making this the first known criminal case to use genetic genealogy for investigative leads. Nothing like it had ever been attempted. Fitzpatrick traced the YSTR profile to a family descended from Robert Fuller, a passenger on the Mayflower. This ancestral connection led investigators to a family friend of the Yarboroughs named Bill Fuller, who was tested and eliminated. The Mayflower connection was correct, but the specific individual was not. The right branch of the family tree had not yet been found. It was not until September of 2019, 8 years after Fitzpatrick's pioneering work, that autosomal SNP testing identified 2 brothers, Edward and Patrick Nicholas, distant Fuller cousins. Edward's DNA was already in CODIS from a prior conviction, but it did not match the evidence profile. Patrick, however, was not in CODIS, despite multiple prior convictions for the same category of offense. Legal loopholes in how and when DNA was collected at the time meant his profile had never been entered into the database. He had been convicted, incarcerated, and released without ever leaving a genetic trace in the system designed to catch repeat offenders. How does someone with multiple prior convictions for the same type of offense avoid having their DNA entered into the very database designed to catch them? On September 29, 2019, undercover detectives collected cigarette butts Patrick discarded at a Kent, Washington laundromat. The lab confirmed the match at 1 in 120 quadrillion. Patrick Leon Nicholas was arrested October 3rd. He was 27 at the time of the incident. As a juvenile, he had committed multiple offenses of the same nature. In 1983, he put a knife to a woman's throat in Richland, Washington. She escaped by diving into a river. He served only 3.5 years of a 10-year sentence. Had he served the full term, he would have been behind bars when Sarah was taken. A search of his home found a torn cheerleader photo and a 1994 newspaper about the case. On May 10, 2023, a jury found Nicholas guilty of first-degree felony charges with an aggravating factor. He was sentenced to 548 months, which is 45 years and 8 months. Had he served the full 10-year sentence he originally received in the 1980s for his prior convictions, he would have still been behind bars on the morning Sarah was taken from the school parking lot. That fact haunted the Yarborough family throughout the trial. The system had released him early, and someone else paid the price. The Washington Court of Appeals later affirmed the conviction, but remanded for resentencing on a procedural issue regarding how an aggravating factor was applied. Nicholas remains incarcerated at Washington State Penitentiary. Sarah Yarborough's case holds a unique place in forensic history as the first criminal investigation ever to use genetic genealogy for leads, a technique that has since been used to solve hundreds of cold cases across the country. That case was the first in history to use genetic genealogy and traced ancestry to a Mayflower passenger. But the next one would be announced as solved on the exact 50th anniversary of the day the victim's body was found, and the suspect had been dead for 8 years. Maureen Brubaker Farley. On September 17, 1971, a 17-year-old waitress in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, was last seen alive. She had mentioned to a friend she might be meeting a man later that night. When she did not show up for work by September 20th, her employer reported her missing. Police found her apartment relatively undisturbed. Her car was still in the parking lot. Exactly 1 week later, on September 24th, 2 teenage boys hunting in a wooded ravine off Eli Road found Maureen's body lying on the trunk lid of an abandoned junk car. She was partially clothed with clean feet, indicating she had been carried there. The cause was a skull fracture from blunt force trauma. Evidence of a harmful encounter was found. Maureen Ann Brubaker Farley was the eldest of 7 children. Her mother called her a wild child and a firecracker. Born on the 4th of July, 1954. She had spirit. She had energy. She had a streak of independence that put her at odds with her parents from an early age. At 15, Maureen married her boyfriend, David Farley, over her parents' strenuous objections. When Farley was incarcerated at Anamosa State Penitentiary, 17-year-old Maureen moved to Cedar Rapids entirely on her own to be closer to him, renting a small efficiency apartment at 522 10th Street Southeast and working as a waitress at Waida's restaurant on First Avenue. She was 17 years old, living alone in a city she did not know, working late shifts at a restaurant to pay rent. She was vulnerable, but she was determined. A man named George M. Smith emerged early as a person of interest, and the circumstantial evidence against him was striking in its proximity. He was a regular at the restaurant where Maureen worked, dining there often enough that the staff knew him by name. He operated a hauling service with a route that took him directly past the wooded ravine where her body was found. He worked at a liquor store next door to Maureen's apartment, meaning he saw her coming and going every single day. He knew her routine. He knew when she was home and when she was not. After the incident, he visited the police department multiple times on his own initiative, suspiciously inquiring about the investigation, asking how it was progressing and whether they had identified any suspects. He refused a polygraph when one was offered. Investigators felt certain about him, but could not prove it without physical evidence that the technology of 1971 could not provide. Why would a person of interest show up at a police station repeatedly to ask about the progress of the investigation into the very crime he is suspected of committing? In 2006, more than 3 decades later, Detective Doug Larison had the 1971 evidence reprocessed using modern forensic techniques, and for the first time yielded a complete male DNA profile. It was entered into coldest. No match came back because Smith had no criminal records that would have placed him in any law enforcement database. Over the following years, more than 15 additional suspects were tested and eliminated by DNA comparison. Smith was the one name investigators could not clear. The one person whose proximity, behavior, and refusal to cooperate pointed in one direction. But he had passed away in 2013 at age 94. He lived to be nearly a century old. He was never arrested, never charged, never confronted. Investigators obtained DNA from Smith's confirmed daughter through a search warrant and sent samples to DNA Labs International in Deerfield Beach, Florida, for a familial comparison test. On September 24, 2021, exactly 50 years to the day, Maureen's body was found by two teenage boys in that ravine. The results came back. The DNA matched George M. Smith. The timing of the announcement was deliberate. Investigators chose that date on purpose. The case was publicly closed on October 5, 2021. Smith had been a regular at the restaurant, a neighbor to her apartment, and a man whose hauling route passed the location where her body was left. He surrounded her on all sides, and he walked into the police station afterward to see how close they were getting. Maureen's mother, 86-year-old Mary Ann Brubaker, said, "We just figure he will suffer in hell for it. What is done is done." She waited 50 years for that sentence. That case was announced on the 50th anniversary of the discovery. But the final case on this list would involve a young woman held captive for 3 weeks. And it would only be solved when two separate cold cases collided through DNA. Kimberly Louiselle. On March 18, 1982, a 16-year-old from Green Oak Township, near South Lyon, Michigan, visited her boyfriend at his new house, where they discussed breaking up. Around March 20th, she headed home, hitchhiking from the area of 8 Mile and Merriman Roads in Livonia. At approximately 6:30 that evening, she made at least 4 phone calls from the area trying to find a ride to South Lyon. None were successful. An acquaintance saw her dressed in a fur jacket and jeans. She was never seen alive again. Kimberly Louiselle loved poetry, horseback riding, and dancing, and dreamed of becoming a nurse. Her younger sister, Cindy Arthurs, shared a room with her growing up. Kimberly had an older boyfriend who had recently moved to another town, and she had gone to visit him one last time. On April 14th, 24 days later, her body was found behind a park and ride in the Island Lake Recreation Area, just 5 miles from her home. She had been harmed, beaten, and strangled. The autopsy revealed a detail that made this case unlike almost any other. She had been gone for only 4 to 5 days at the time of discovery, meaning she was likely held captive alive for approximately 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Alive. Held somewhere within driving distance of her family, who were searching for her the entire time, while she endured conditions that are difficult to comprehend. Her sister Cindy later stated that Kimberly was repeatedly harmed during that captivity. The gap between March 20th, when she disappeared, and early April, when she passed, represents 3 weeks of suffering that the family has carried with them ever since. In 1983, roughly a year after Kimberly's disappearance, a tip came into police naming a man called Charles David Shaw, who had lived in the area and had recently destroyed the interior of his apartment. The tip was logged. It was never followed up on. Police did not track Shaw down, did not interview him, and did not collect any evidence from his destroyed apartment. Shaw was found deceased in Detroit on November 27, 1983. From accidental circumstances. The one name that might have solved the case a year after it happened was never pursued, and the person attached to it was gone before anyone thought to look. What would happen if two entirely separate cold cases, investigated decades apart, suddenly pointed to the same man through DNA? That is exactly what occurred. Investigators working the separate 1983 case of Cristina Castiglione sent evidence to Othram Labs in May of 2022. Othram used forensic-grade genome sequencing and genetic genealogy to identify Charles David Shaw. His identity was confirmed through 3 familial DNA comparison tests using living relatives. Shaw's genetic profile was then entered into CODIS. Meanwhile, Michigan State University criminal justice students, interning with the cold case unit, had been digitizing old Louiselle case files and noticed Shaw's name from the 1983 tip that was never followed up on. Evidence was resubmitted to the State Crime Lab, which in June of 2023 found one previously overlooked sperm cell, preserved for 40 years on a single slide. It matched Shaw's profile from the Castiglione case. On September 14, 2023, Michigan State Police announced they were 100% confident Shaw was responsible. His family described him as a person with a disturbing life who struggled with mental illness. In 1981, he was arrested for attempting to take a woman from a parking lot. He lived at the Brookdale apartment complex in South Lyon, directly in Kimberly's orbit. Police believe he was responsible for at least 2 cases and suspect he may be linked to additional ones from the early 1970s until his passing. No trial was possible. Case was solved by a single cell on a slide, a tip from 1983 that nobody followed, and a group of university students who noticed what professional investigators had missed for 4 decades. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.